Wes Craven is horror movie royalty, as he invented the iconic slasher villain Freddy Krueger in the classic Nightmare on Elm Street series, as well as reinventing the slasher subgenre again a decade later with the metatextual horror satire Scream. Beyond that, he's had a long, illustrious, and varied career, which is why we're talking about the legend today, and are proud to inaugurate him into the Arrow in the Head Horror Hall of Fame. Wes Craven was born in 1939 in Cleveland, Ohio, to an extremely religious Baptist household. So strict, in fact, that Craven said in a 1984 interview, "As fundamentalist Baptists, we were sequestered from the rest of the world. You couldn't dance or drink or go to the movies. The first time I paid to see a movie, To Kill a Mockingbird, I was a senior in college. My whole youth was based on suppression of emotion, as they say in psychological circles. My family never got in touch with their rage, so making movies, these awful horror movies, no less, was, I guess, my way of purging this rage." Craven's professional career then begun as an English teacher at Westminster College. However, later in his life, Craven got interested in making films, and, as luck would have it, a friend of his got him a job working as a film editor on instructional videos.
At RCA Victor Research and Development Laboratories, research engineers and advanced designers work together.
A few years after doing that, Craven eventually moved on to directing and editing X-rated pornos, including working on the classic 70s adult film Deep Throat. Eventually, he decided to go more mainstream and make a horror film, since it was one of the easiest genres in his mind to be made cheaply and quickly, and he utilized the skills he had learned in his previous jobs. Unfortunately, his first film, The Last House on the Left, was hell to make. The conditions were apparently so shoddy, and the subject matter so intense, that the lead actress fled at one point thinking they were shooting an actual snuff film. It got so bad, in fact, that Craven never wanted to make another horror film again. However, after the success of Last House on the Left, which made multiple times its meager budget, Craven had trouble getting funding for anything non-horror related. So he decided to film out in the Nevada desert for another horror cheapie, The Hills Have Eyes, about a family being terrorized by cannibals. After those successes, he was allowed to branch out a bit, even directing a comic book film, Swamp Thing, in 1982. However, that film, and his previous films he directed, were financial busts, so he begrudgingly went back into horror. Now luckily, in the interim, he made friends with Bob Shea, then head of New Line Cinema, which had been struggling financially at the time, who nonetheless wanted to work on a project with a young Craven. Craven then came up with the idea for a horror film that would be about a child killer being murdered by the victim's parents, only to come back as a vengeful spirit that would kill their other children in their dreams. That, of course, was the premise for the classic Nightmare on Elm Street film. And that vengeful spirit was none other than the iconic Freddy Krueger, to be played by character actor Robert Englund.
Please, God.
This is God.
In an interview, Wes Craven stated that the film was actually a pretty hard sell, saying, "The far right was starting to rattle these cages, and I think the studios were afraid of making a film that had blood in it. They also just felt it was too far out, that people would be confused about what reality is." But luckily the film did get made, and it became the horror masterpiece we all know and love. In fact, Nightmare on Elm Street was such a box office success that it saved New Line Cinema from bankruptcy, which subsequently became nicknamed The House That Freddy Built. Furthermore, the film brought back a prominent and important theme of Craven's work, which is the seediness and evil of real life, only exaggerated in his films for maximum effect. In this case, the monster is essentially a pretty real and unfortunately relatable one, that of a child abuser given access to his victims through his job, shielded by a corrupt system. First the school for letting it happen, then it's the justice system for letting him get off in a technicality. Of course, most times they don't become vengeful dream spirits, but even that is a metaphorical genre film representation of collective, systematic trauma. Here's what Craven said of the Nightmare movies. "The basis of most of my films is essentially true life. The kind of peak pictures that I've made are very much my readings of current psychological, social situations that I perceive in the world, to a kind of B-movie genre format, but making it as deep as I could." And this theme was explored in many of his other films, even in something like The People Under the Stairs, which came out years later in 1991, was essentially a stark condemnation of Reaganite conservatives, class disparity, and racial gentrification. It, of course, like Nightmare on Elm Street, exaggerates all these themes to a horrific degree, such as sticking people inside the walls of the house for misbehaving. but it's all still coming from a real place of societal frustration and anger expressed through the genre of fiction. Now, unfortunately, Craven gave away the rights to the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, which he always regretted, leading to some lackluster sequels, even if there were some interesting ones, such as the fan-favorite entry Nightmare on Elm Street 3, which Craven actually helped write. Afterwards, Craven would go on to direct other cult classics, such as Serpent and the Rainbow and Deadly Friend. The latter of which was supposed to be Craven's answer to Starman, a more contemplative PG fish-out-of-water sci-fi film. before studio meddling made him turn it into a horror film, frustrated by his lack of control on the set of Deadly Friend, and losing the rights to the aforementioned Nightmare on Elm Street. Craven decided to develop a horror film and potential franchise that he would have complete control over. This led to him writing and directing the supernatural slasher 1989's Shocker, about a serial killer who uses electricity to come back from the dead, while starring the X-Files' always great Mitch Pileggi. Now, unfortunately, that film was a critical and box office failure, so in 1994, Craven finally came back to his beloved Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, almost a full decade after the first film was released, doing a metatextual take on the material, where Freddy Krueger was in fact real, terrorizing actress Heather Langenkamp, who played Nancy in the original '84 film, but here is literally playing herself. Wes Craven even cameos in the film. This experimental version of New Nightmare led Craven to eventually direct Scream a couple years later, which was the satirical Gen X take on the slasher genre that Craven's own Nightmare on Elm Street franchise helped popularize in the 1980s.
If they watch Prom Night, they'd save time. There's a formula to it. A very simple formula.
Now, Scream brought back the genre in a big way, with a slew of copycats in its wake, but none ever held a candle to the original. He even went on to direct all the Scream films himself, up until the very recently, as in this year, sequel announced from directors of Ready or Not, which was unusual for most horror franchises. Even better is that each Scream sequel would then skewer different tropes of the genre, such as cliches of the horror sequel in Part 2,
Number 1, the body count is always bigger.
or those of horror remakes in Part 4.
You forgot the first rule of remakes, Jill. Don't fuck with the original.
In between the Scream films, however, Craven also directed the much maligned werewolf film Cursed. This shoot was a complete nightmare, and dragged on for over 2 years because the Weinsteins, who were producing the film, continually meddled with the production, which included things like changing characters' relationships, recasting a large portion of the cast, which included Robert Forster and Nightmare lead Heather Langenkamp, who all shot scenes that were cut before the storylines changed. And worst of all, covering up practical werewolf effects from American Werewolf in London's Rick Baker. They covered up Rick Baker's practical effects with inferior mid-2000s CGI. They practically shot the whole damn movie twice. Now this, of course, did nothing to save the film, and it ended up being one of Wes Craven's biggest disappointments. Now, luckily, Craven bounced back, showing his tenacity and perseverance, and decided to direct some non-horror films, such as the prestige drama Music of the Heart, and the big-budget thriller Red Eye, which became an unexpected financial and critical success. He even directed a segment in the romantic anthology film Paris Je t'aime in 2006. Unfortunately, on August 30th, 2015, Wes Craven passed away from brain cancer in his Los Angeles home at the age of 76. His final film was Scream 4. After Craven's death, his estate then secured the rights to the first Nightmare on Elm Street film in the character of Freddy Krueger. There's currently hope that a new Nightmare on Elm Street film will be produced that would skew closer to Craven's initial vision of him. Here's hoping. Since then, however, Wes Craven has become a horror legend, with some even calling him the master of horror. His mark on the genre will surely be felt for generations, but it'll always exist in our dreams, I suppose.